Hey, Scott, we'll wait like 2 more minutes. Hopefully we'll get more than 18 people on this call. Alrighty, we'll go ahead and get started. Scott, can you hear me? You might give me a wave.
I can.
All right, everybody. So with the pandemic and the quarantine and everything, we can't have everybody in the same room. So this was the next best option, and hopefully it works out. But everybody, try to make sure that you mute your computers and try to not play on your phones and pay attention to the presentation, and have all your bosses try to leave you alone for about an hour so you can concentrate. But I thought this would be a good presentation, kind of based on the COVID-19 situation. We've had a lot of requests from subcontractors claiming productivity losses due to some of our procedures, our social distancing, some of our site-specific safety plans that require us to, either be fully suited up or hire additional staffing to complete a task that may or may not have needed that prior to this situation. Also, uh, some of the customers as well, you don't want, a bunch of people in a room, so you can't have any overlap in some of your activities. So some people have seen some schedule activities that have, been overlapped, that have gone finish to start throughout their entire schedule, and it's added a little bit of time. So I thought, so Scott actually reached out and asked if we had anything that we wanted to talk about, and he provided some pretty good notes and pretty good presentation that we're about to go over, that outlines some of the items and topics that we had in the invitation. So thanks everybody for joining. Uh, just make sure everybody stays muted so we're not stepping all over each other. And if you do have any questions or you want to say something, uh, use the conversation chat or the meeting chat icon and type your question, and then we can share that information from there. All right, Scott, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ben. You can see my screen and you guys can hear me okay? All right. Well, I noticed when I got on camera that I'm looking much older. My hair's thinning. I don't have the physique I once did. However, uh, with that said, I'm Scott Audius. If you don't know me, I taught at Eastern for about 12 years, retired from there, and I am the CEO of the TAG group, and TAG stands for the ACE group, which encompasses ACE Consulting. And ACE Consulting obviously does work with Gray doing scheduling and providing personnel. So I had worked with Ben in the past at different presentations, and one that we have been giving and talking about have been directly related to this COVID-19 issue, and how that is affecting our productivity. So Ben, Ben and I had talked, and we talked about the inefficiencies and productivities, and that's kind of what I'm going to go through today. So with that said, let me jump right in. Well, first of all, let's jump into the concept of force majeure. I always call it FM because it's a little, it's a French word and most people don't get it. But pretty much is just a standard contract clause that says if something goes wrong that's out of our control, um, the legal contract we have, uh, you know, needs to be modified in some way. And there gave some examples there. You see, it has epidemic in there, any acts of God, flooding, different things. It seems like we've had a lot more to deal with than just this infection lately. So that's just a contract clause that says, hey, we have an agreement, but things could change, and it's not your fault. It's not our fault. But because things change, there's no liability or obligation for performance of some of these things, like Ben alluded to at the beginning. So, in order to do a labor inefficiency and a lost productivity assessment, you got to figure out, first of all, what is productivity assessment, and obviously that seems really simple, but it's a lot more complicated than you think. It's really just an assessment of the efficiency of a worker. We know through various different guides. I'll show you one here called the P405. But we have different different guides out there that show you productivity of individual people, individual workers working in specific trades. We know that circumstances all are different based on the project. But we know that there is an average efficiency for productivity that we can compare to. Now, what do you compare that to? The easiest way I get people to uh, give me that data is, rather than looking in a guide and figuring out how long it should take you, um, the best thing to do is, when you put together your schedule, you solicit that input. And the common question I get from contractors when I ask them to solicit manpower estimates from people are, they say, well, we're a general contractor. We don't need to worry about the subcontractor's manpower. Well, you do need to worry about subcontractors' manpower, because there's two things that a sub can do to you to make a project be delayed. Number one is not show up on time, and number two, not bring enough people. So we need to be able to measure those in some way. So step one is, in order to do a productivity assessment, you have to have that data. So going back to labor estimates and durations, if I wanted to figure out productivity, I could sum it all up in something called man days. Man days is a historical, term used. It's not something that I came up with. So just be aware that that's a standard term that we use. We simply take the quantity of work, we divide it by the unit size, and we multiply that by the man hours per unit divided by 8, which is an average work day, times the delay factor. Now you can see there's a couple of variables that could be affected. If you're working 12 hours days, 12-hour a day, that could be affected. So I'm going to kind of go through how this calculation is in greater detail. It's basically saying, okay, if you have 100 block, and you have 10 people and they lay 10 block per day, how long is it going to take you to get it done? Well, on the surface, it looks like, well, if you have 100 block and you have 10 people, you could get it done in one day. But there are other things like production efficiency factors, delay factors. All those things affect the productivity of people. So there's three different factors that come into production efficiency. Number one is production efficiency rate, and that's strictly just a percentage based on the factor affecting productivity. Availability factor. So production efficiency deals with, okay, how quickly are we doing the work, right? Availability factor determines how much other stuff do we have, in order to do the work. And I use the concept of when I used to work on embassies. On embassies, everyone had to be pre-screened before they came in the gate. Well, the problem with that is, when you take 600 or 700 people and try to push them through one gate, you're going to have an effect on their availability because they're not going to be available for 8-hour workday. So that's what an availability factor is. Also, if you have breaks or other things like that. And then the delay factor, that's essentially taking the production efficiencies rates, averaging them, and converting it into a factor that modifies your man-day estimates. So let's kind of jump into that real quick. There are really 7 different productivity losses that we can categorize things. Um, and legally speaking, these were most of them are point to. The first one being weather. I don't need to go into great detail here because the fact is that we deal with weather all the time. It is a it is what we consider in the contingency world or the risk management world as a known unknown contingency or unknown known contingency, however you want to kind of see it. And what we're saying is we know it's going to rain or we know it's going to snow. We just don't know how much, right? So we can come up with averages and all those different things. But at the end of the day, if we have unusual severe weather, that's going to affect productivity. And that's kind of a no-brainer. That's the one we deal with on a regular basis. I commonly get the question, how do you deal with weather in a schedule? And my simple response is, what is your client willing to do? Some organizations will give you an allotted amount of weather days for every individual month throughout the year. And if you exceed those, then you get an additional weather day. Some clients say a 1-for-1. If you can show us a weather day documented, we'll give you a 1-day, delay. Or if it's a weather day related to site work, because the site work's on the critical path, we could give you a day for the weather and a day for it to dry out. So obviously there's a loss in productivity there. So weather is the first productivity loss. The next one is something we hear a lot about, but we don't really really understand or contemplate the consequence of doing things out of sequence. But out of sequence work is simply we have a plan, right? That plan is tied to different predecessors within the plan. And if we have to go outside that normal sequence, we're going to have to be compensated because there's going to be additional time. Now, this one is a little bit more difficult to understand. So I'll give you a great example. I was dealing with a change order on a road project. We were redoing roads on Camp Lejeune, and we would do about a thousand linear feet of road, and then we would hit some unexploded ordnance, or there would be something in the way, we'd break something, or something would happen that wasn't documented. And from that, we had to remobilize our equipment to another section of the road and then start up paving operations or start up grading operations in that section. Well, because of that, we had an out of sequence work that we had to deal with there. Now, there's two different, in the scheduling world, there's 2 different ways that we look at out of sequence work, or we look at a schedule when it deals with out of sequence work. One of them is retain logic, and the second one is progressive override. And once again, to try to make this simple, we use retain logic because logically it makes sense to start on one side of the road and go to the other side of the road. It doesn't make a lot of sense to do 1,000 feet here, do another 1,000 feet there, and then remobilize back to your original spot, the end of your first 1,000 feet. So that out of sequence work, there's obviously issues with that. And we deal with out of sequence work all the time. We normally just don't worry about compensation for that. But the reality is out of sequence work does affect productivity. So be careful when you go against some of the logic you have in schedule. And once again, that's important that we have a good schedule with good logic. That way we're not tied, to a specific logic, and then we're taking things out of sequence and we're asked for change orders for additional time. The next factor is stacking the trades, and we do this once again all the time. We crowd people in different spaces, and I think of places like the mechanical room at the very end of construction. It seems like the mechanical room is where kind of everybody finishes their final tie-ins at the end, and we have a lot of people working in there. In this case, in the current COVID-19 situation, obviously we can't have a whole bunch of people in a small space, or we shouldn't have that whole bunch of people in a small space. In addition to that, we have a loss of efficiency. Just imagine if you had a mechanical contractor working with electrical contractor, and they're trying to work over top of each other, and the mechanical rooms are small to begin with, and we have to deal with that. And so we're going to have a loss of productivity there. Much more difficult to quantify there, but if we're getting the amount of labor by trade by task at the get-go, then we can actually, have some type of documentation to be able to measure it too. The next factor is overtime. And when I talk about overtime, well, let's first go back to, the effectiveness of overtime. We know in construction, it's kind of a big joke that, we don't work 40 hours, and that's 100% true. The average work week as defined by ENR and the Engineering News Record is a 50-hour work week, 5-10 hours a day. We all know that we've worked more than that, on jobs, and and knowing Gray and working with Gray, I know that there is a lot of additional time, additional work time and overtime involved in there. So we have to, first thing is the effectiveness of overtime. Overtime is effective, obviously, because if you're basically from a purely hypothetical standpoint, if you increase the amount of availability through additional time, you're going to get more work. But research has shown that if you do overtime on a regular basis over a long period of time, the effectiveness of that overtime decreases substantially. Now, I had a project where we did overtime for about 9 months, and it was it was 24 hours a day, 2 12-hour shifts, and the productivity did go down. It's human nature. People get tired. Those are things that we have to consider. Now, as far as overtime goes, it is, we know the first thing we're going to do is if we have a loss in productivity that results in a delay in the schedule, we're going to go ahead and increase the amount of availability. And in order to do that, we are probably going to opt for something like overtime. So when people charge you for overtime, like I say, a subcontractor were to charge you for overtime, and this is a really good point that I got pointed out young in my career, is it's not like they're going to charge you 1.5 or 0.5, because you already paid them for 1 point, right? You're not paying them for additional work. You're paying them for the additional the quicker time to be on the job, so more availability on the job. So it's not like they're going to pay you half time. So we always know time as time and a half, right? Well, we've paid the time, a part of the original base bid of their contract, but the overtime, that 0.5, is what we'd have to be, could be responsible for. Now, it's not truly 0.5. It actually works out to be more like 0.3, and the reason being that is that in a fully burdened rate, we have to take into account things like vacation and medical and dental. And it's not like, hey, if I work overtime, I get more medical benefits. You don't, unless you get hurt, of course. But you don't get more vacation, if you work overtime typically. So it's not 0.5, it's more like 0.3 because it's a fully burdened rate. So productivity losses, a factor could be overtime. Another factor could be the restricted site access, and we're dealing with this one right now. The fact is that our access to site could be greatly affected by items like COVID-19. What we do, the confines of the space, the confines of the location. I mean, if we're trying to build in New York City right now, it's pretty much locked down. So we know restricted site access could be a major issue. Next factor would be unavailability of manpower. And you'll see the majority of these we deal with every single day, and it's not new to us. But we know that manpower is difficult to begin with because still skilled trades today, there's a lack of skilled trades, and we all know that. However, in the current environment we have, that already difficult situation has been made 10 times more difficult because now we don't only have a lack of skilled trades, we have a lack of people that are willing to work because of this COVID-19 issue that have skilled trades. Now you say to yourself, okay, well, I work around a whole bunch of old construction guys. They're going to come out to the job. Well, a lot of skilled trades are, especially the really highly skilled people in the individual trades, are older, right? People are susceptible more as they get older, has been shown in the statistics that you've seen on television. If someone were to put their hand up, and if you read through some of the regulations that they put out about COVID-19 and say, I don't feel comfortable going to work because I think I could get sick or whatever, that could be an excusable reason to stay on unemployment. And in addition, with unemployment being what it is, related to the amount of money that they're giving people now to stay on unemployment, you could see it makes a very, very difficult situation for a general contractor or a subcontractor. So whether we agree or disagree with it, the fact is we have to deal with that factor. Availability of manpower is a big issue, not only because we lack skilled trades, but because of the current environment we're in. A cumulative impact. So if we take everything together and we put it all together, we're going to have a ripple effect that could have multiple different effects on the project schedule. So everything we talked about, one individual impact may not be significant, but when paired with a different impact, you have a lack of manpower, and then you have availability of resources, or weather or something, or out of sequence work. So we may take one of those factors in itself, may not be significant, but together could affect the project substantially. So the cumulative effect is the other one. So we've talked about productivity losses and the basic 7 productivity losses. Now let's talk about availability factor. We know that, if you ever worked in the trades, you ever been on a job site, which most people have in construction, at one point, you just don't go out there and work and just show up to work and start working. You have things to consider, like, okay, how long is it going to take me to get set up, to get all the equipment set up? How long is it going to take me to get everybody in the groove of what they're doing, what their responsibility is going to be? I gave you the example of the gate, getting everybody through one central gate in order to work. I worked on a flight line before, and we had to coordinate our movements with flights going in and out of an airport. So those all have an effect on the availability of our resources. We cannot say that somebody's going to come and work for 8 hours or 480 minutes. We know there's going to be things that we have to quantify that are unscheduled downtimes that we have to consider in our estimates. And and most people, when I tell them this, are saying, it's not that significant. And I'm going to show you some production efficiency factors, availability factors, and you're going to be surprised about how much it actually affects productivity. And then we have a delay factor. So we have availability factor, how much is our resources available to do work? And then we have a delay factor. And a delay factor is just a way we can modify our mandate estimates in order to properly predict how long something is going to take. Okay. So, when we go through, and I think I covered this a little bit later, but the average productivity is 67%. So think about this. If you have an 8-hour workday, only 67% of it, by average, is actually being productive on the job. So, and that's because of the availability of your resources, number one, and number two, all the different production impacts that you have. So we have 33% of our day on average that is unproductive. And when I tell people that, people kind of are kind of amazed by that concept and say to me all the time, it can't be that significant, and it is. It's been shown time and time again that that number is pretty dang accurate. So we can, when we plan our schedule, when we deal with things or we deal with changes, we have to go back to the fact that we had to acknowledge that we're going to production efficiency factors and availability factors affect the amount of productivity, and you're only going to get about 67% of the time actually being productive. So only basically 2/3 of the time. Another third is going to be unproductive. And there's all those reasons we previously went to. Here's the top 10 type of delay factors you see there. When you don't, some of them you don't like to see right there. Poor planning and scheduling is one. Poor site management and supervision. If you had to ask me, based on the amount of jobs I went to and the amount of analysis that I've done for different clients, what is the biggest issue, biggest factor that affects productivity on the job? And I would say number 4. And number 4 is poor site management and supervision. The inability to prioritize, the inability to utilize a schedule is usually the issue. Not always, but usually the issue. I'd have to say the second thing is resource shortage. It's not a matter of getting subcontractors on the job site. It's a matter of getting them on the job site with the proper resources, whether that may be people, machinery, or equipment. Now, here's a really interesting chart here. We had these, we have 8 different factors. This is a production efficiency guide chart I took out of something the Department of Defense uses for construction assessment. And you can see they have it: workload, site area, labor, supervision, job conditions, weather, equipment, and logistics, right? So low productivity would be more like 25%, high productivity would be 85%. So with the average being 67 right in the middle. And you can see that if it's 67, then we're saying that there's really no impact from a productivity perspective. If it's higher, we have greater productivity. If it's lower, we have worse productivity. And based on that number, and you can see the percentages there, the percentages are added together. And then you see that at the bottom it says production efficiency factor. So the total of workload, site area, labor, supervision, job conditions, weather, equipment, and logistics is 509 divided by the number of factors, which is 8, and we come up with an average of 63.6. So by doing this and assessing those 8 different categories, we can determine that only 63.67% of our time is going to actually truly be effective. So that kind of plays into, okay, we know what we know what being productive is. We know what the average is. We know the factors affected in productivity. So how does that really affect us in the end? Well, for a task that is not on the critical path, which is simply defined as the longest path through the network, or the path that has 0 total float and 0 free float, if it affects a task that's not on the critical path, it's an irrelevant factor. So if you have a subcontractor come to you on a job and say, hey, I was working on this task and I've had inefficiencies involved in that because of this individual situation, the ability for you to pass those dollars on to the owner are kind of limited, because at the end of the day, if it's not on the critical path, then really what's the effect? So they require more manpower to do an individual task? Yes. But as far as it affecting the project schedule, that's much more difficult to contemplate. Now, keep in mind that if you have a factor that affects not just one subcontractor, but multiple subcontractors, kind of like the COVID-19 thing, we can look at this from like a global perspective. We can look at it as a project wide perspective, and we're going to see the impact in tangible ways by things like having negative float. So just know this. All of our project schedules are put together simply using the critical path method, and the critical path method, in a simple explanation, is it's a way of prioritizing activity based on the amount of spare time they have. So, we talked about, if they're critical or non-critical task, those can affect the project duration. And the reason I kind of went back here about the critical path is because it's much more difficult to assess a additional time if it's not affecting the critical path. Now, we're dealing with two different things here. We're dealing with money, and we're also dealing with time, right? Now, a subcontractor may say, well, hey, I need both. I need more money and more time. Well, why do you need more money? Well, I had to have more people out there, and it took me longer to do what I needed to do because of the COVID-19 requirements. Okay, so that's a money issue. We can discuss that as having additional resources out there and what your original estimates are. And then as far as time goes, the time is a difficult one because if it doesn't affect the critical path, how can you really grant them more time? There will be some people that affect their activities affect the critical path, but most of them won't. So try to keep those two things separate in your mind when you're dealing with some of these delay costs that you may have to pass on. Now, how do we know we have an issue? It's simply by looking at negative float. When you update your schedule, if your float first turns from positive to negative, and if you look on a schedule, and it gets a little confusing, but when the late dates start or end before the early dates, that means you have negative float. And negative float is really just the opposite of positive float. Instead of having enough time, you don't have enough time. So if we have negative float, we have to recover that in some way or get additional time, one way or the other. Now, one way of recovering the time, well, first of all, we have to do an assessment. We have to say, okay, this is what happened, and this is my assessment of what occurred. And if you go back into kind of another presentation I did for Gray on time impact analysis, I go into greater detail about how to perform one of those, but it's really actually pretty simple. You take the delay, you break it into activities, and you insert it, what they call as a fragnetted network, into a project schedule where it's tied into the individual logic of a schedule. And by doing that, you can quantify the amount of time that is, you're affected by, situations that we talked about before. What we have seen thus far is that rather than people giving more money, they're giving more time, or they're giving more time and money. The whole concept, I think people are a lot more conscious of the fact that this greatly affected all industries, and we have seen by and large that most of our clients are getting additional time from the owner and additional monies from the owner to deal with this force majeure incident or issue. So all kind of rules are off there when you have to deal with something that goes out of the context of what your contract is. That may not necessarily be the case with some of your clients. I mean, obviously, if you're in a manufacturing environment, you want to get open as soon as possible. So they probably could be more reluctant to grant you additional time. They're probably willing to give you additional monies to increase your availability, but not necessarily time. So kind of in summary, we've gone through what a production assessment is, production loss. We know we want to compare our productivity of what we're doing on a job to the productivity that we estimated. And the best way to do that is during the planning stages of a schedule, get input from subcontractors on the amount of people and the amount of duration they need for every individual task. Make sure that that schedule is cited as um, as a rider to the contract, meaning it's inclusive in the contract, and then hold them to that. Obviously, document it, and then when somebody comes back to you and asks you for money, or when you're asking the government for money, you have a benchmark to refer back to. When we put a schedule together, we have to consider things like availability factors. We only have 67% of our time, 2/3 of our time actually being productive. So we may need to adjust our estimates up to give us additional time because of that productivity. And it could be something that's limited amount of time you can work on a job during certain hours, or it could be limited access, and we've gone through all those individual items. We went through how we calculate a production efficiency factor. We take the 8 different factors and we sum them and divide it by 8, and we figure out the average productivity for individual activity. And everyone says, well, can I do a production efficiency factor for the entire job? No, you want to do it per activity or per scope of work. So if it's higher than 67, you have greater productivity. If you less than 67, you have less productive. And we know that when we have a delay, ultimately it goes back to the schedule and how it affects the critical path, and we can quantify that with a time impact analysis. So that's kind of my spin on it a little bit. When you get into productivity, it's very important that you have a benchmark to set it against, and the only way to get that benchmark or get a reliable benchmark is to solicit it from your subcontractors during the pre-award stage or the award stage. So I want to open it up to any questions anyone may have. Don't all speak at once. So I have a question. Does anybody have anybody asking them for additional monies right now because of this COVID-19 thing? I think everyone would say yes. So how are you guys dealing with that?
So in my situation with the Bridgestone, it's not necessarily been asking for more money. It's them asking for more time, since we had to pull everybody off site and our site closed down. So for them to come back when the site opened back up, they didn't want to be held to any kind of certain dates without having something agreed upon before they came back out. Not per se money, but time in my situation.
Have you dealt with that already, or are you still dealing with that?
So it was actually pretty easy with the owner. We just told them we're going to need extra time to get people back on site. Expect a few delays here and there. Luckily, we were wrapping the project up, so it was just more or less punch list items. I think it probably could have been a little bit more serious if we were in the middle of erecting steel, but we luckily were able to dodge a bullet there, and they didn't give us any kind of heartbreak on that.
Well, that's good, and that sounds like it's a pretty clean way of dealing with it. If everybody had to leave the site, then it's fairly simple. If everyone had to leave the site for 30 days, you know what? Then obviously people are going to get an extension of 30 days. Much more complicated if not everyone had to leave.
Right. It could have got a lot more ugly, but luckily everybody was on the same page.
Anybody else have an example or want to discuss how they're dealing with this current issue we're in and people asking for additional money or time?
So Scott, something that on some of the projects that I'm on right now, we have the opportunity to perform the same scope of work over and over and over again. Like phase 1 is the same as phase 2, is the same as phase 3, is the same as phase 4. And one of the things that we talked about is trying to judge a non-COVID impacted phase against a COVID impacted phase to try to judge lost productivity that way. Have you seen that be successful?
I have, and they refer that that's actually referred to as a reflective schedule analysis, and it's I had dealt with this in court a few times, and you normalize the schedule using the original baseline, and then you look to see how it was actually impacted after the fact, and the delta between the two is what you should get. Um, and That's much more difficult to get than strictly just a time impact analysis, because a time impact analysis says, okay, we have these activities that affected these activities. Well, in this COVID thing, it may be a lot more complex than that. Or if we don't, here's the other thing too. If we don't deal with the COVID-19 thing and how we're going to deal with the consequences of it, both time and money, when we get to the end of the job, it's much more difficult to justify than it would be to do it now. So.
Yeah, so kind of to add on a little bit, the projects that I'm referencing, the overall milestone dates, the overall schedule did not extend. They were not going to do that. So what we're trying to analyze and we're trying to prove is the additional manpower, the additional labor hours, the additional effort that was put into it, like a phase 3 versus a phase 2 that was unimpacted.
Mm-hmm. And that can be done, and that's that. But like I said, you have to. What we typically do is we take the software and we load it into Primavera. You can do this in Project too, but it's a lot less effective. We load the baseline in, and then there's something called Claims Digger within Primavera, and it goes through and analyzes everything, and it tells you every change. And just to give you an idea, last one we did on this had 368 pages of changes. Um, that's not one change per page. You could just imagine how many changes occurred over the individual job. So.
Okay.
Anybody else want to have anything to share about their job and how this is being affected, or question related to it? Ben said he's given away what you said, hard liquor, didn't you say, Ben?
Yeah, I've got a couple bottles over here at my desk.
Okay. Everybody turned around and looked at you, but.
So I don't remember who told me this, but there was someone out there, maybe a month ago, that was talking about, due to, the restrictions of having certain people, like the certain quantity of people in a space. Like you talked about the mechanical room always being, jam full of people at the end of the project. The story that I'd heard is that the customer came down and said, change all of your, start to start, all of your finish to finish, make everything finish to start, and then let's, do a time impact analysis on that and find out what the added duration of the project is, and then that would be your claim. I don't remember who told me that. If they're on the phone, it'd be kind of interesting to see how that worked out.
That's actually kind of interesting, because that would be, I would say, extremely tough to do. But boy, that would elongate the schedule significantly. Because we know, man, we deal with a lot of starts in a schedule. So something simple as, hanging
Right.
and finishing the drywall, so. But,
Exactly.
But if someone was willing to give that to you, I'd take that in a heartbeat and I'd run with it. So.
Scott, have you seen on other projects that you're on, have you seen this handled as a force majeure, or have you seen people push back on it being an act of God or something that should have been foreseen?
It's really, by and large, well, the original consensus, the funny thing is, the government, as soon as this happened, the government sent out notices to a lot of contractors, and I had been privy to those that said, you will not be given an extension. You will not be given extra money. And that was for the first week and first couple weeks. And then they realized the impact was significant. And plus they had a lot of pushback. And now they come to a point where they said, okay, we'll give you additional time, but we're not going to give you additional money, because there's no extra money involved there. but that's actually had a lot of pushback right now because you guys know if you're not working, you still have cost regardless, and that's the difficult one for a lot of owners is who's paying it. Last ENR I was just reading said that most owners are paying for it. Commercial governments, most owners are taking that delay and paying that delay. So it's not, and I also talked with one of my bonding agent about that. I said, how many people are coming back to the bond and, are pulling the bond on individual projects, and the response was very, very little. So really the standard right now is the clients are picking up the delay costs and the additional times. I'm surprised no one's surprised that only 67% of your time is actually productive. I guess not. So and when I usually say that, I get a lot of pushback from people because people will tell me that can't be right, and that actually is, a factor that's been proved time and time again. Any other questions that anyone may have? My suggestion to you is if you get into if the owner try to meet with the owner, try to figure out a good logical way of doing it. If that's just changing relationships, or there's got to be some method to your mandates there, or it's comparing to the original schedule. Meet with them, try to figure out an agreed way of analyzing this. And if you can't get an agreement, then you may want to step back and consider some of the options that we discussed here about looking at, some of the, comparing productivities, looking at people's time. Most owners are just going to say, we were laid off for this period of time. We're going to give you that additional time. Ben, do you have anything else?
No, that's everything I've got. If anybody, after this call decides that, they've thought of something, they want to ask a question, you can email me. I can share it with the group of all the people that joined today, and that way we can circle back. Because and also moving forward, I know that this whole thing's not over yet and everything's not resolved. So if there are some issues that pop up that are a little bit stickier or difficult to deal with, feel free to reach out to me. I may or may not know an answer, but I definitely am in contact with a lot of people that have a lot of experience in this realm. So I appreciate everybody getting on today, and Scott, I appreciate you putting this presentation together and on short notice, and I think it's very applicable. Not just today with what's going on, but also in the future. I mean, this isn't going to be the last time that somebody has a delay or an impact on their project. So this is great information. I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. And I just want to offer you guys can always drop me an email or a phone call or text at any time. I'll be more than happy. We work with you guys a lot. So if you guys, just want to reach out, no cost involved there. If you just want to call and run something by me, Ben, you could share my information with everybody's on the call. I'll be more than happy to deal with them, except for Sisselberger. I don't want to deal with him at all. So he's behind me smiling. He's actually blending in a little bit. All right. Well, like I said, if you have individual cases, feel free to reach out to me. All right, Scott. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for joining. Have a good day.